that you write about that I think is so important is the makeup of the left in the United States and how it's actually served as a detriment to accomplishing some of the goals that we desperately need in this country. So, for instance, most of activism done by the left is by middle class individuals rather than workers. And so how do we change that? How do we shift that? And why is there a disconnect between, the middle class left, the activists, and the workers who we do desperately need in order to spur real change in the system?
Okay, let me take the second question first, which is why does it
Okay.
exist? It ex- there have been two times in modern history where this disconnect existed. One was in the period after the 1848 revolution. That's a long time ago. Um, when the modern left didn't really exist, and the labor movement had certain amount of churning in it. The left was still dominated by kind of a liberal intelligentsia, and it's in the 1880s and 90s that you see the birth of what we would today call the modern labor movement, which had an articulate and committed socialist element in it, sometimes coming from middle class individuals who were déclassés, who kind of left their surroundings and moved physically into working class areas, started organizing them, or sometimes from intellectuals that were generated from the class itself, usually skilled workers who had literacy, who had a certain amount of self confidence, and more importantly, who had a lot of leverage because they had very scarce skills. That era starts in the 1880s and 90s and continues all the way, I would say, into the 1970s. This is an era where if you were on the left, you took it for granted that you were in some way either directly implanted within working class communities or you were in the milieu of an organization that was directly implanted in it. And that organization influenced you, disciplined you, kind of gave you a culture, a moral and a political anchor. And the activism of that time, it's actually the wrong word. We can talk about what activism means. It's a bullshit word. The activism of that time, the organizing of that time was directed towards mobilizing the working class and holding yourself accountable to the working class. That really comes to an end in the 70s and 80s. First of all, primarily starting in the English speaking world, and by that I mean England and the United States, not Australia. It's in the Atlantic world where that starts, first in the US, then later in England with the epochal miners' strike, which was decimated and destroyed by Thatcher and by the British employers. What happens in these two countries is that the trade union movement is basically decimated. Now, that's the denouement of a process that started earlier, the first part of which was the destruction of the communist parties and the smaller socialist parties around them. These organizations had been the politically articulate, the strategically kind of ideologically and strategically savvy part of the labor movement. In the United States, by soon after the McCarthy era, that's pretty much over. The Communist Party is reduced to a tiny size, and it moves very rapidly to the right, anyway, towards pure electoralism and a kind of very by the books black nationalism. In England, it comes a little bit later. The destruction of the communists, on the one hand, who had been the strategic arm of the trade union movement and the more radical arm, and then later the trade union movement, means that now the left is reduced to certain individuals in certain places who have certain values, almost all coming from the middle class. And there's only one place left for them to go, and that's the universities. Mm-hmm. Now, when they go into the universities, I think, and this is, I came in at the tail end of that. These are the people who I was around in the US when I moved to the US. I don't think they realized fully what was happening. They thought they were simply on an island like Survivor, and they could subsist on that island, gather their forces, and come back out when conditions were better. What they did not fully understand, I think, and still many of them refuse to admit, this is not an island. Universities have a class and an institutional context. Universities are primarily a place where professionals come for upward mobility. And when you put a bunch of self-identified socialists and Marxists in universities and you give them university jobs, they are going to sooner or later start internalizing the aspirations, the ambitions, and the goals of university professionals, which is upward mobility, not organizing. Even if they want to organize, how are they going to do it? You're sitting in a fucking you're sitting in a classroom.
Yes.
You don't have any access to
You
it.
don't
Yeah,
want to do it.
you're imagining what you're going to do if you ever tried organizing them. And 15, 20 years into it, who have you been recruiting into your organization for 20 years? Grad students, people who want to get jobs for themselves, people who see things that are problematic in the country, but as their numbers increase, the odds increase, the most of the people you're bringing in, what they're pissed off about is what they're experiencing. And so you turn from an anti-capitalist left to an anti-discrimination left. The left today is fundamentally, it's an anti-discrimination left. That means what's it want? It wants to remove restrictions from upward mobility. That's its fundamental goal. It is so institutionally and structurally removed from people who are the manual laborers, the blue collar laborers, the people who work for wages and a living. It's very hard for them, A, to conceptualize what that world is, B, they don't instinctively care about it. And the cap today is this, in my opinion. The left today, much of what we call the left, the university-based left, has no interest in organizing beyond itself. In fact, it's the level of contempt and paternalism and condemnation that I've seen on the left for working people. They have to come in and fill out a form before they are deemed worthy of being supported. This is the basket of deplorables, I think. It's not just Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is simply the more visible end of the progressive intelligentsia. It's the go-to position. You walk into any meeting of the left today, the go-to position is, how do we deal with the working class's conservatism, their X, their Y, their Z, and how do we teach them? The position of middle class, day class A intellectuals going to the working class for 120 years was, our job is to learn about their conditions and make ourselves relevant to them. The position of the left today is, how do they become worthy of us? So it's not a left that's going to go anywhere.
I completely agree with you. I know that the standard, and I think I'm even seeing it in the chat, so forgive me, but like the standard kind of easy response to that is, aren't you describing liberals and not leftists?
Absolutely not.
Right.
Listen, I lived through the 90s and 2000s. I've been around those sects on the left. The go-to position was, first of all, regarding the working class, was the working class is racist, it's misogynistic, it's imperialistic, it's conservative, and that working class is an obstacle to progressive change. Now, mind you, a lot of that's true. But the fact of the matter is, whatever their ideology is, that's your constituency. And you're not going to win them over by lecturing to them. You either have the position that they're born this way, or you have the position that there's social conditions which are making it rational for them to adopt certain positions. There will be a certain stratum that's hidebound and you're not going to win over. But if you really believe that the essence, the soul of the class is that they're a basket of deplorables, the best you're ever going to do is you're going to lecture to them. That's the best you're ever going to do. But more typically, it's a suspiciousness. I can give you hundreds of stories about this. It is not that the dividing line between the liberal intelligentsia and the left intelligentsia is wafer thin.